Little housekeeping issue before we get started, before we get into other things. I'm going to ask you, at the end of the prepared comments, you have the opportunity to write questions and put them on a card, and David will pick them up. Please do two things for me. Don't write a paragraph, write a one-sentence question, because I have trouble getting all the way through them. And secondly, please write legibly so that I can read it. I was squinting at some of those last month, and I had no idea what you wrote. And it was probably the best question of the night, and I couldn't read it. So if you would do those two things, that would be very helpful. Last month when we met, we had the ambassador from Mexico. And one significant part of her discussion was the issue of immigration. But I found it very interesting that she rephrased it, and it was not a discussion of immigration, it was a discussion of migration, which I thought was a very interesting way to look at the broader issue that she was talking about. But I thought that as I thought about it afterwards, I really didn't have any foundation in the basis of the philosophy of immigration or migration. And so our speaker tonight is going to take us a step backwards from what's going on at the southern border and talk about the philosophy of how do we think about immigration, migration, whatever you want to call it. So we got a speaker to address that for us today. I'm delighted that we have with us Nathan Pippenger, who is an assistant professor at the United States Naval Academy in the political science department. We'll do the technical stuff. We've got a PhD from the University of California in Berkeley, and then he came to Annapolis, where he's now working at the Naval Academy. There's a human side to him. He's got an 18-year-old son who probably dribbles on his tie and steps on his foot now and then, and still can't speak quite intelligibly, but a lot of fun. He loves to talk about it. The thing that I would observe, though, we're talking about immigration, and I would observe that I think Nathan is probably an undocumented immigrant to the state of Maryland. That he came here, I won't say in the dead of night, but I doubt that he went through immigration and he got customs and he registered with the state. But he's got some very interesting and I think very thoughtful things to talk to us about tonight. And hopefully it'll expand all of our thinking a little bit on this whole subject of immigration, migration. So please give us a warm hand for Nathan Pippenger.
I'm going to see. All right, so the mic works. Try moving it up. Good. All right, there's that. Is that good? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks, Scott, for the introduction. I have an 18-month-old son. Although if he's still stepping on my feet and dribbling on my tie when he's 18 years old, I'll still love him. So, I'm a political theorist by training, and one of the things that political theorists do, and the reason that we have a sort of odd status within political science departments, is that whereas my colleagues ask questions about how the world is, political theorists tend to ask questions that are more along the lines of how the world ought to be, which is something that sometimes social scientists are a little bit allergic to doing, but we're going to try it tonight. And so what I'd like to do is introduce you to a debate that goes on among scholars in my field, and some of the major positions that people have taken in that debate that might help you think about what your own views are about immigration and the kinds of questions and issues that it presents. And so I'll walk you through that. But just as background, I know had a presenter from the Pew Research Center who came and spoke about migration fairly recently, but for those of you who wanted a refresher, there are about 281 million migrants in the world. About 4% of the world's population is born in one country but then crosses borders to live in another. The majority of those people who cross borders reside in Europe and North America, but Europe and North America are also the world's most common senders of migrants to other parts of the world. So while most migrants in the world reside in Europe or North America and Europe are also the countries and parts of the world that send the most migrants out. Migration is, among other things, a big economic deal. It's a big economic deal not only for countries that receive migrants for their domestic labor pool, but it's also a big economic deal for the migrants themselves. So in 2020, migrants sent about $700 billion home in what are called remittances, which is money that is earned in a destination country and sent back to friends and families who live back home. So there are lots of reasons why people might cross an international border. Many people cross international borders to work because they can make more money and have greater economic opportunity in the country where they want to head to rather than their home country, and they can send some of that money home. Some people go abroad to study and are migrants temporarily in another country so that they can earn a degree or study abroad. I was that kind of migrant at one point in my life. Lots of people migrate to be reunified with family members. So the most common pathway for legal migration into the U.S. is through family reunification. So U.S. immigration law privileges migrants who have immediate or extended family members who are also present in the U.S., but this can take a long time. In some cases, family-based reunification migration in the U.S. can mean that you wait for more than 20 years before you're allowed in, so that can be a very, very slow way of getting in. And then lastly, there's a sort of broad category of people who migrate for more or less political and/or humanitarian reasons, and this can include refugees, asylum seekers, people who are displaced by conflict or famine, victims of natural disasters, so on and so forth. And so there are many, many reasons why people migrate. Not all migrants migrate for the same reasons. So, most people take it for granted that states, and by states I mean countries, nation states, most people take it for granted that states have the right to control immigration, that states have borders. Their borders have border guards and border crossings. Sometimes they have walls and barbed wire and guards with guns. And it is within the right of states to say people are or are not allowed to come in. And that's up to states to make that determination. This is a fact of international politics that very, very few people question. Very few people think that there's anything odd about this. Political theorists think that, like anything, this stands in need of justification, right? So one of the things that we do as political theorists is we look at political practices in the world and we say, what's the basis for this? What justification, if any, is there for doing things this way rather than some other way? And so one question that political theorists debate is, what, if anything, gives the state that right to control migration, particularly to control entry into its borders? So there's a very, very famous article on this topic by a political theorist named Joseph Cairns. And in 1987, he wrote an article that starts this way. This is it's the longest quote I'll put on my slides, but it's worth reading aloud. Borders have guards, and the guards have guns. This is an obvious fact of political life, but one that is easily hidden from view, at least from the view of those of us who are citizens of affluent Western democracies. To Haitians in small, leaky boats confronted by armed Coast Guard cutters, to Salvadorans dying from heat and lack of air after being smuggled into the Arizona desert, to Guatemalans crawling through rat-infested sewer pipes from Mexico to California. To these people, the borders, guards, and guns are all too apparent. What justifies the use of force against such people? Perhaps borders and guards can be justified as a way of keeping out criminals, subversives, or armed invaders. But most of those trying to get in are not like that. They are ordinary, peaceful people, seeking only the opportunity to build decent, secure lives for themselves and their families. On what moral grounds can these sorts of people be kept out? What gives anyone the right to point guns at them? That's a very, very good question, and a question that has spawned 35 years of debate among political theorists. And Cairns had a very interesting strategy for thinking about this question. He said, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to walk you through 3 different theories of justice, each of which has a fairly distinguished pedigree, each of which has pretty good arguments in its favor, each of which generates the same conclusion. So I'm going to take you on a tour of his way of breaking down this question. So first, Karen says, let's begin with some premises about citizenship and borders. The first claim he's going to make, this is an important premise, is that citizenship today operates like a form of feudal privilege. And so today, if you are a citizen of a country like the United States, the position that you occupy compared to other people in other countries is a bit like the position that a feudal lord would have occupied, say in 16th century France, compared to his peasants. You're born into this position. It's a position that confers enormous advantages of wealth and status and a better life. It's a position that other people can't have, right? So just as a peasant could never become a lord, right? So most citizens of, say, Sierra Leone are not going to become citizens of the United States. It's supported by law, right? It's not merely a customary position, but there's the force of law behind it. And it's not something that you can possibly be said to deserve. You can't earn it. You're just born into it. And so he says, we think that feudalism has disappeared from the world, but it hasn't. Citizenship in a rich country is a form of feudal privilege. That's his claim. The second claim he's going to make is where you are born is what political theorists would call a morally arbitrary fact about you, right? So now here is a morally non-arbitrary fact about me. I try to be a good father to my son. I try to teach him the difference between right and wrong. I don't yell at him or hurt him in any way. I try to be a good father. That's relevant to judging me as a moral person or not, right? If I were to let my son go hungry, you would think, well, he's not a good person morally. But I also have gray hair. That makes no difference to the kind of moral agent that I am. You can't judge me or say that, oh, he's a bad man, he's got gray hair. Right? Or I hope, I can't do anything about that. So where you're born is a morally arbitrary fact about you. Right? It doesn't make any, you can't earn it. It doesn't make you bad or good. It's not something you can deserve. It's morally arbitrary. From a moral point of view, you could have been born anywhere. And so, with those two premises in mind, he's going to say, if you look at most theories of justice, you will find that although they are different, they lead to the same conclusion. So first, he says, suppose you're a libertarian. Right? Suppose you're the kind of person who believes the most important thing is to keep government powers very limited, because that's the way to maximize human freedom. Suppose that you believe, following philosophers like John Locke, that the purpose of government is to protect people's natural rights. And so John Locke famously argued that there are three natural rights that people have: to life, liberty, and property. And the purpose of governments is to protect those three rights. And if governments attack those three rights, they're not legitimate, they should be overthrown. If governments fail to secure those rights, they're failing at their jobs. And so if the state exists to protect these natural rights that we have, and it doesn't have a lot of other purposes, that's what it's for, right? So libertarians believe in a very limited role for the state. Well, if that's true, then how do we make sense of, say, a law that bans a company from California from hiring a worker from Mexico? Is it not within the property rights, if I own a business in California and I'd like to hire someone from Mexico to work, why do I have to say, well, they have to get a visa and it has to get approved and the visas are capped, and what if they're not allowed to cross the border? Why can't I hire anybody I want? Why can't people cross borders to work in another country if they want to? Isn't that a massive, massive curtailment of people's freedom, including their freedom of movement, right? So Scott joked before I came here up on this stage, I'm an undocumented immigrant from California. But it's true. Nobody stopped me and said, are you allowed to be in the state of Maryland? I just came right in. And most of us would recognize it as a serious obstruction on our freedom if we weren't allowed to just cross from the border to, say, Maryland into Virginia without having the right papers. But then a very good question to raise is, what makes that different from crossing the border from Canada into the United States? Now let's assume you're not a libertarian. Let's assume that you're a liberal. And you're a liberal who has more sympathy for the government to have a certain role in our lives And the liberal philosopher who Cairns is interested in is a very, very, very famous 20th century liberal philosopher named John Rawls, who some of you may have been made to read if you went to school and took a class with someone like me. And John Rawls, in 1971, published an extraordinarily important book called A Theory of Justice. He was a professor at Harvard. This was probably the most important work of liberal political philosophy written in the 20th century. And Rawls says this. Rawls says there are certain birth circumstances, or what he calls starting points, or starting places, that cause especially deep inequalities and cannot possibly be justified by an appeal to the notion of merit or desert. Desert not like the piece of key lime pie I had, but desert as in deservingness. And so, for instance, let's say that you are born to the children of wealthy people who can afford private tutors and nice schools and colleges and summer camps to enrich your skills. That's great. You're a very lucky person. But you could have been born to a poor family that couldn't afford those things. Just because you were born into a wealthy family that could afford them doesn't mean you deserve it more. Just because the poor family couldn't afford it doesn't mean they don't deserve it. Desert has nothing to do with it. But notice, deep, deep, deep inequalities in our lives are shaped from the beginning by circumstances about our birth that we have no control over. Now, given that, how do we create a just society? How do we create a society that is modeled on justice? And Rawls says, if you want to know what would a just society look like, you have to engage yourself in a thought experiment where you put yourself in the original position, is what he calls it. Imagine you're designing a society. It doesn't exist yet, you're designing it. And you're standing behind what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance. You don't know anything about yourself. You don't know whether you're going to be a man or a woman. You don't know whether you're going to be born into a rich family or a poor family. You don't know whether you're going to be white or black. You don't know what religious views you'll have. You don't know whether you're born on a farm or in a city. You don't know anything about what your life is going to be like. Will you be smart? Will you be athletic? Will you be attractive? Will you be good at playing the flute? You don't know. If you didn't know anything about yourself, what kind of society would you design if you didn't know who you were going to be? And the intuition here is that nobody would design a society that was racist, because what if you're born into a racial minority? No one would design a society that is sexist, because what if you were born into a disfavored sex? No one would design a society that discriminated against people in any of these ways, because what if you're born as that kind of person? What if you draw the short straw? And so his point is, no one would choose this kind of society. Now, very famously, at the very, very beginning opening pages of his book, Rawls says, now I'm assuming for the purposes of the argument that we're talking about a closed society here. I'm not getting into the question of immigration and migration. I'm just not going to talk about that. But later on, people are going to pick this book up and they're going to say, hold on, isn't the country that you're born in a starting place? Isn't it a starting place that can cause deep inequalities in how your life turns out? And isn't it something that you can't possibly be said to deserve? Those of you who are born in the United States, have you ever found yourself saying, I'm so lucky to be an American? That implies that other people are very unlucky. And if other people are unlucky, what does justice say we should do? All right. So, but let's assume you are neither a libertarian nor a liberal. Let's say you're a utilitarian. And the only thing you care about is maximizing the overall happiness of all people. Right? This is what utilitarians believe in. It's sometimes what they call the greatest good for the greatest number. So they're not as interested in questions of rights like libertarians. They're not as interested in questions of fairness or justice like liberals. They want to know, how do we maximize happiness? So, the question is, if we're talking about the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which people? People like me? All the people in my country? All the people in the world? When we're talking about overall happiness, is there any reason that's not totally arbitrary why we would limit overall happiness to, well, just people in my country? Why wouldn't we talk about the overall happiness of everyone in the world? So there's an economist who studies global migration named Michael Clemens. And he says restrictions on migration are like leaving $1 trillion bill lying on the sidewalk. Right? So economists have this joke about how certain things are like a $20 bill lying on a sidewalk. It means something you can get that costs you nothing and is all gain. And Clemens says migration restrictions are $1 trillion bill lying on the sidewalk. He wrote a paper in which he claims the bottom line is this: a modest increase in emigration out of low-income countries, just 5% of people now living in low-income countries, would expand the world economy by several $1 trillion every year. This is the greatest single opportunity for global economic prosperity in our age. The gains to greater international labor mobility offer $1 trillion bills lying on the sidewalk. And one of the reasons for that is, when a worker moves from a low productivity economy to a high productivity economy, their individual productivity can increase by as much as 1,000%. And so there are huge unrealized gains just lying there. And so, if you reconstruct these three positions, whether you're a libertarian, a liberal, or a utilitarian, Cairns is going to say it doesn't matter, because they all generate the same conclusion, which is that justice demands open borders. And so, this thing that seems very intuitive, almost not even worth questioning, every country does it, it's part of the world, why bother asking questions, turns out to be very, very difficult to justify once you start to poke at it. Not everybody agrees with Joseph Cairns, though, right? And so you can't publish an academic paper if you just decide that you already agree with what everyone else has said. Right? You can't get tenure by saying, well, there's nothing left to say about this, the debate is over. So we have to find out. And our universities pay for us to go to conferences, and what you do at a conference is you sit around a table with other people, and then you argue with them, and you all go out for drinks afterwards. So you need to disagree with people. But you also need to disagree with people because there are strong counter-arguments, and so I want to walk you through a few of those, and then what we might say about those counter-arguments. So, why does the state have the right to control immigration if it does indeed have such a right? Well, one thing you might say is, first, it's just part of sovereignty. It's just part of self-determination, right? For a group of people to rule themselves, they have to have control over immigration admissions. That's part of what makes a state sovereign to begin with. If a state doesn't have control over that, it's not sovereign. Right? That's a very, very common and very powerful rejoinder. But it faces this objection. That argument is arguably circular. And why is it a circular argument? This is something that in democratic theory we call the boundary problem. And it's a circular argument for this reason. Because the group of citizens which decides to exclude migrants didn't include those migrants when it made the decision to begin with. Meaning that we are trying to impose a decision on a group of people who are not included in the decision when it was made. Now, there are lots of ways to interpret democratic principles. There are lots of ways to argue about what democracy means. But one powerful way of understanding democracy is that if you are coerced by a decision, right? If you are made to live under some rule that is imposed on you with the threat of violence backing it up, right? And make no mistake, the threat of violence backs up borders and border guards. And you are made to obey that rule, then you're owed a say. You're owed a say in that rule if you have to live by it. So the question is, what right do states have to impose rules on other people that those people get no say in? That seems undemocratic, right? And so this appeal to sovereignty starts to look very circular because it presumes the very same kind of closure and boundaries that it's trying to justify, right? So the second approach you might take would be to say, well, states have cultures, and they have an interest in protecting and preserving their distinctive cultures, and if a lot of immigrants came in, they might not be able to do that anymore. And to this, there are a couple of objections you might raise. So first, who gets to define the national culture? So if I were to ask you, what does it mean to be an American? If we have 85 people in the room, we're probably going to get 86 different answers. And so whose answer gets to win? How do we define our national culture, right? Second, let's assume you can answer that question. Let's assume you can give a good answer to that question, and one that's not sort of fuzzy and difficult to pin down. It seems like the argument from culture really only works if, one, you think it's a prerequisite of political membership that you also be a member of the culture. Right? So notice, would you require of other Americans that they sign on to certain cultural aspects of American culture before they're allowed to have citizenship? You have to have a certain religion. You have to speak a certain language. You have to like certain foods, right? If you wouldn't make those demands on people as a prerequisite of political membership, then how is it a basis for keeping them out of the country in the first place, right? So if you don't think that you have to be a member of a culture in order to be a citizen, then why does culture ground political exclusion? And second, what if the host culture, i.e. the culture of the receiving state, is not homogeneous? What if you live in a diverse culture, right? Like the United States is a fairly diverse culture. And so it seems like only if you happen to live in a place where the culture is homogeneous and everybody belongs to it, and that homogeneous culture is strongly incompatible with the culture of the migrants who are coming in that case, you might have an argument. But notice that that's rarely the case, and it's certainly not the case in the United States. It's very hard to say that there is a single homogeneous American culture to which every American belongs that is deeply incompatible with migration from the outside. And people have said it, right? People said it about Catholics in the 19th century. How many Catholics in the room agree that they're not part of American culture? All right, next. A third way of justifying immigration control is by an appeal to democratic principles. So you might say the problem with a lot of open borders arguments is that they presume that a community of citizens is sort of like a giant labor pool, right? That what we all are here are we're workers and employers, but we're not, we're citizens. And that's a different kind of relationship. And an association of democratic citizens isn't just people hiring each other. And it also isn't just people who share a common culture. Rather, it's a group of people who are trying to rule themselves together on terms of equality. So it's a society that doesn't have a caste system. It doesn't have stable hierarchies. It has a group of people who are trying to control their common life together as equals. And what are the preconditions of living that way? What needs to be the case for us to rule ourselves on terms of equality? And so you might say that one precondition, or rather a set of preconditions, how can we rule ourselves democratically? You might say, well, look, first of all, if we say we the people are going to rule this country, then we need to know who the people are, right? Which means we need to have some kind of boundary. Now that doesn't say how the boundary is drawn. It doesn't say what principles you appeal to when you have the boundary. But you need to have some kind of a sense of who the overall group is, who it includes, and who it doesn't include, right? Those boundaries also underwrite forms of reciprocity, right? One of the things that stabilizes democratic politics is the understanding that our interactions with our fellow citizens are not a one-off affair. I might disagree with you today, but I'm not going to try to burn your house to the ground. I'm not going to try to completely destroy you, because tomorrow we're going to be back at this. And in the next election cycle, we're going to be back at this. And 10 years from now, we're going to be back at this. And that incentivizes all parties to show restraint. I can't cheat you or burn you because I'm stuck with you, right? The shadow of the future hangs over our interactions. But again, notice that what that presumes is stability in the composition of the group to some extent. If the group is constantly shifting and you don't know who your partners are going to be tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, the bounds of the ground for reciprocity is a lot weaker. Third, and this is a simple point, but I think a really important one, we have a representative system of government. Someone is accountable to me, right? The mayor is accountable to me. My member of Congress is accountable to me. My senator is accountable to me. The president is accountable to me. That's possible because there is a clear connection between the people and their representatives. And representative government couldn't work if that clear connection were to break down. Which is another reason to think that democracy in some ways might require some kind of boundary that says who's in and who's out. So, this is obviously a complicated debate. There's a lot to be said on either side of it. I want to leave you with some remaining questions that I think follow from some of the positions that I've outlined here. So, let's posit that we go with counter-response 3, i.e., we want to say in response to this skepticism about border controls that, well, you make a lot of good points and maybe there's something to be said for your position. However, it might be the case that some discretionary control over immigration and borders is just necessary for democracy to work at all, right? So we might want to say that. And if we do say that, then there are a few questions that I think we are obligated to answer. One, what are the limits of that control? Can a democracy set whatever immigration policy it wants? Can a democracy say a total and complete ban on Muslims from entering the country? Can a democracy say, as the US did in 1924 in the Johnson-Reed Act, we're going to have quotas that put strict caps on racially undesirable people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. We're going to prioritize racially desirable people from Northern and Western Europe. We're not going to allow anybody from Africa and Asia. That was US immigration law for 4 decades between the 1920s and the 1960s. Now, when Lyndon Johnson signed the 1965 immigration law, he celebrated the overturning of the 1924 law with the national quotas and the very explicitly racist provisions in that law. He said that law was un-American in the highest sense. That's what he said. But I've gone back and read the archives of the New York Times from 1924. And the senators that co-sponsored this bill in 1924 bragged about it in the New York Times. And they said, the America of our grandchildren will thank us for freezing an ideal racial composition in place and keeping out undesirables. They'll thank us for this. And so the question is, if a democracy is allowed to control its immigration policy, is there any limit on that? Or are they allowed to do whatever they want? And if there are limits, what are they? Second, when democratic states make decisions about immigration policy, do they owe an explanation to outsiders? Do they owe some justification? Here's why we're doing this. Does the US have to justify its immigration policy to Mexicans who are affected by it? If the US intervenes in another country and creates displaced persons, does it have to justify the resulting immigration policy to the people who are displaced by its actions? Is that consistent with treating outsiders with equal respect? Third, if democratic states decide we're going to limit immigration, we're going to limit admissions, does that obligate them to do other things? So for instance, if we're not going to allow people from poor countries to emigrate to wealthier countries, does that mean that we have to supply them with more foreign aid so that they can prosper where they are? If we're not going to give a place to go for people who are displaced by climate change, does that mean that we have to act more aggressively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that they don't have to flee where they live in 20, 40, 100 years when it's underwater? What about our foreign policy? If we decide to take some course of action on our foreign policy that is likely to displace a lot of people, do we then have an obligation to let them in? And if we say in advance, oh, we would never let those people in, should that change our decision calculus? Okay, and finally, how can democracies balance openness to immigrants with solidarity? What kinds of solidarity are available to democracies if they want to become immigrant-receiving democracies, as the US at various points in its history has been? And a thought that I'll leave you with is that the proportion of people living in the US now who are born in a foreign country is as high as it's been ever, with the exception of one time in our history, which is right before the 1924 Immigration Act was passed. So around the turn of the 20th century, the foreign-born percentage of people in the US was about 15%, which is about what it is now. That's a historical high point. And so one answer to this question is, How did the America of the 1920s respond to that? Is there going to be an analogous century later? Thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing any questions you have.
Gee, Nathan, I was hoping this was going to be simple and I could walk away, and the answer was 13. You've made it a lot harder. But I think you've given us all a lot to think about. I've got a couple of questions, but David out there is collecting questions from the audience. Hopefully there'll be ones that I can read and share with you. But let's start with one or two. One of the questions that's come up a couple of times is, what is a nation?
So there is a very famous essay that was published in, you'll have to forgive me, my son woke me up at 4:29 this morning. I want to say 1883. There's a very famous essay published in 1883 by a French thinker named Ernest Renan called What is a Nation? And Renan sort of went through the list of traditional ways of defining a nation. And he said, you know, there's language is one way of defining a nation, shared language. Shared religion is another way of defining a language, a nation. Shared territory, right? Shared lineage, bloodlines, is another way of defining a nation. Shared sort of historical events, right, is another way of defining a nation. And the conclusion he came to is that every single one of these various ways of defining a nation is just empirically false. That there's no nation, whether it's the French or the Germans or any other group that you would call a nation, that actually does share those qualities in a relevant way. So to give you an example, prior to the French Revolution, most people in France did not speak French. Right? There's a very small, something like 2/3 of people in France did not speak French on the eve of the Revolution. And so now we think of French as being a language that is so integral to the idea of the nation of France. But that's a fairly recent and modern development. And so Renan's conclusion was, well, there are nations, and yet all of the various kinds of ways of defining nations seem to be not able to withstand scrutiny. And the very famous answer he gives is, and it gets translated as, a nation is a daily plebiscite. And by daily plebiscite, he meant a nation is a choice. People decide themselves to be a nation. Every day, they wake up and they decide that they're going to be a nation. It's a form of consciousness, right? It's a form of thinking of yourself as a nation. And if people stop thinking of themselves as a nation, they are no longer a nation, right? Is more or less his answer. That's what in philosophy we would call an intersubjective phenomenon, right? So there are objective things, like mountains are objective. You may not believe in a mountain, but if you go trying to fly into one, it doesn't matter whether you believe in it, it's there. Some things are purely subjective. If you prefer the Beatles to the Stones, that's a subjective opinion. It's also objectively true. But then there are things that are intersubjective, which are beliefs that, they're things that come into existence because two or more people believe that they exist. So Ernie and I believe that we are friends, but if Ernie stopped believing that we were friends, we wouldn't be friends anymore. We just wouldn't be. And maybe nations are like that. So they're very real, but the basis that they have is that people believe that they're real.
In that line, then, are the Kurds a nation in the Middle East? Are the Basques of Spain and France a nation?
They certainly believe that they are. Right? This is a question. The Kurds think that they're a nation, but they don't have a state. The Basques think that they're a nation, but they don't have a state. Ukraine thinks it's a nation and does have a state. Vladimir Putin doesn't think it's a nation. Right? So whether people believe that something is a nation is important, and it can have major historical consequences. Ultimately, I'm not an expert on either the Basques or the Kurds, but I think that the belief that you are a nation is significant.
Is there a difference between a nation and a state?
There's all the difference in the world. The state is a legal political entity that monopolizes violence over a particular territory. That's what states are. Nations are groups of people who believe themselves to be linked in some way, right? But you can have multinational states, You can have states where there are no nations within them, right? So you might argue that, say, the United Arab Emirates is a state, but is there a nation there? Possibly, maybe. You might say of the United States. Is the United States a multinational state? Or is it a state with no nation there? Then there are nations that don't have a state, right? So you might say the Basques, the Catalans, the Palestinians, the Kurds, right? All might be national groups, but there's no state. And so the idea that the proper sort of home for a nation is the state is a recent and modern idea. But there have been lots of different political formations over time, right? So empires, famously, included all sorts of different, what we would now call national groups under one political unit. There was no idea of the need for nation states then. It was this idea that, well, the proper political unit is the empire, which is multinational, right? You could argue that certain forms of regional or federated governments work the same way, right? So the EU is a political formation that involves lots of nation states, but then also has a form of aspired to consciousness or solidarity that is post-national. It's European, it's continental, it's not national.
So is this issue of immigration really a state issue rather than a national issue?
I guess what I would say about that is the politics of immigration are likely to become more volatile to the extent that the receiving state thinks of itself in strongly nationalized terms, right? So if you have a state where people have a very, very strong sense of nationhood, that's likely to produce, I think, a more volatile politics around immigration.
You kind of touched on this, but it's come up again. Is not a common language important to define a community or a state?
It might be. I happen to think that it is. I have a paper forthcoming. This is not self-promotion, I promise. That it is partly about a very famous and important German philosopher named Johann Gottfried von Herder, who was a theorist of language and nationality, who famously sort of argued that we think in language, that language sort of sets the outline for human cognition. It's not possible for us to think without words, and so the words in the language that we have very profoundly shape the kinds of ways that we think, the thoughts it's possible for us to have. And for that reason, Herder argued that there is a kind of a characteristically, say, Greek way of thinking. There is a characteristically German way of thinking that's rooted in the German language or rooted in the Greek language. And that might be true. In fact, it probably is true to some extent. However, where is the nation of people who are all united by speaking English? Right? So, like, not all Americans speak English, but then there are lots of English speakers in Jamaica or in the UK, in Canada, right? There are a lot, and so language is one important factor in defining nationality or sort of bounding nationality, but it's not the only one, and it's not a perfect one either, because language speaking skills don't correspond neatly to state boundaries.
Assume we let excuse me, assume we let 100 million of the poorest South American and African refugees migrate to USA. How do we keep USA from declining to conditions of their former home?
So I think you need to answer the question of why you think people who come from poorer countries live in those circumstances to begin with, right? So it strikes me as not coincidental that most parts of the world that are very poor today were victims of European colonization. And so you might say, well, they're poor because they'll bring poverty with them if they come here. Or you might say, well, they're poor because their countries had their wealth extracted from them and left behind lots of dysfunctional economic and political institutions. And that doesn't necessarily follow with people. You might argue that if a lot of Americans moved abroad, they might bring some of America's problems with them, but maybe not. Maybe not.
When do immigrants become nationals of the country where they immigrated to? Is it when they naturalize?
So I would actually ask, I would turn that question around, I'd ask people to think about this. So if someone were to immigrate to the United States and think of themselves as strongly American, however they define that, right? Maybe they decide that they really love road trips and jazz and Broadway musicals and cheeseburgers, I don't know. And they sort of, in the way that you can become a Francophile, right, or an Anglophile, somebody becomes an Americophile. Does that make them part of the United States? Or is their naturalization dependent upon other people sort of accepting that about them, accepting their self-description, and saying, yes, I agree with you that you're an American, right? So do you need the approval of other people, right? It's a tough question. I mean, the way that I would answer this is that I think our identities are formed dialogically, right? Not monologically. I can go through the world and tell you what kind of person I am. But ultimately, my identity is not just up to me. It's about how all of you react to me and respond to me. And so I would argue that in a very important way, it's hard to become a member of a community if other people in the community don't accept you or don't believe that you're a member of the community, right? So for instance, do we have any Francophiles in the room? Do we have anybody who speaks French and loves to go to France and wants to drink French wine? And so the question is, does that make you French? Right? Does loving French culture make you French? Does a French person who lives in France and despises French culture therefore become not French? Right? So let's say that they reject Catholicism, they hate wine, they would rather eat anything besides a baguette, they think Paris is loud and obnoxious. What they really would like to do is move somewhere else, but they just can't seem to get it together to do it. Does that make them not French? Maybe in a sense, but in what sense, right? It's a good question.
What particular immigration policy reforms are needed to enable us to cope with the rapidly growing long-term immigration demands from climate change, political disruptions, conflicts, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The nice thing about immigration is that there are a lot of levers that you can pull. There are lots of things that are immigration policies. And so when you think about the factors that cause people to cross international borders, they have to do with global famine, global poverty, wars, natural disasters. And so if you had a world where there were fewer forces driving people to cross borders, you wouldn't necessarily have to have as much concern over how to absorb migrants because you wouldn't have as many, right? And so one thing, what I would tell somebody is if I had somebody in the room who had very strong views, they were very skeptical of migration, they're very skeptical of American society's ability to integrate new migrants, they think that the most we can do, the best that we can do is to close our borders as much as possible. What I would say to them is, you had better be the biggest climate change hawk in the world. You had better want the most aggressive action on climate policy of anybody. You had better want an all-electric vehicle fleet and huge reductions in greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow. And the reason for that is, climate change is going to displace millions of people from where they live. And they're going to have to go somewhere. And they won't be able to go back home because it will be underwater. And so once large parts of the world quite literally become uninhabitable and you have huge movements of population from one place to another, somewhere is going to have to take people in. Somebody is, right? And so if you are skeptical that states can do that without suffering huge amounts of decline or division or anarchy, then you should want to reduce the reasons that people have for moving and crossing borders in the first place. Right? And so this was implicit in one of the questions I asked in the last slide. If democracies decide to limit immigration, does that obligate them to take other steps? Right? And so you might say, yeah, if democracies don't want to let poor people in so that they can become wealthier, if you want to in effect say, well, I'm sorry for your bad luck that you were born in a poor country. That's really unfortunate for you. But I wasn't. My life is nice. I'd like it to stay that way, and frankly, I don't feel like letting you in. Well, I'm phrasing it in an intentionally provocative way. But if you were to say that to someone, and you want to justify that as a valid immigration policy, then maybe you have some other obligation to discharge towards them. If you're not going to let them come to where they can make more money, maybe you should make it possible for them to earn more money where they are, by promoting economic development or something like that, beneficial trade deals. There are some other policy levers that you can pull. The question is, which ones do you favor and why?
What about the argument that we have large numbers of jobs going undone that many U.S. citizens don't want to do?
Yeah, this is a big problem. So there's a lot of socially necessary work that a lot of people don't want to do. And there are different ways of resolving that problem. right? So it's funny, before I came over this afternoon, I was working on a paper and I was writing about this very question. So imagine a job that you don't want to do. It can be anything, something that's dirty. Maybe you have to spend a lot of time doing physical labor that makes you tired or hurts your back. Maybe it doesn't pay very well. If you don't want to do that kind of job, but you admit that somebody needs to do it, the question is it better to try and make those jobs desirable by passing laws that would drastically raise the minimum wage, for instance, or make it easier for workers to unionize, so that, well, yes, nobody necessarily wants to say clean out toilets, but it pays really well, and the benefits are quite generous, right? You could imagine that kind of world. It's not the one we live in, but you can imagine it. Or you could say what we're going to do is we're going to import a class of laborers from countries that are much poorer than ours, for whom, all things considered, this is a pretty good job. Now, it's not a job that I would do, but maybe for them. And I think that that is a policy solution that has to sit fairly uncomfortably with anybody who thinks of themselves as a believer in equality. I think if you think of other countries as places where, well, they'll come here and do this because, well, nobody here would do it, it's beneath them, but some other people from outside will do it. Empirically, it might be the case that there are people willing to do those jobs for very little money. But if their presence in your society is premised on their willingness to do dirty work for a little money that nobody in your society would be caught dead doing, and that's why they're there, that's very troubling from a democratic perspective. In ancient Athens, there used to be a class of people called the metics. And the metics were people who were laborers in Athens, but they could not become citizens. They were not allowed to become citizens. They were permanent foreign laborers. And we tend to think of Athens as, the inventor of democracy, and they were. They deserve a lot of credit for that. But it was a democratic society that relied in a very real way on the exploitation of a foreign labor class, right? Work that the Athenians did not want to do. They brought in foreign laborers, and they said, you do this work, and you can live here, but you can never join our political community, and you can never become citizens. And so the question is, would you be willing to submit yourself or your children to those kinds of circumstances? And the answer is no. Are you comfortable asking somebody else to submit their children to those kinds of circumstances? Right? It's a very, very tough issue. And one of the reasons it's a tough issue is because there are lots of migrants who would happily take that deal. They would happily come to the US and clean toilets or pick strawberries and not demand citizenship because it's still a better life than what they would have in their home country. That is I genuinely don't have a good answer for you on that. It's a very tough moral question. And I submitted a paper to a journal where I made a very strong argument against guest worker programs. I said they're exploitative. And I got a lot of pushback from one of the reviewers who said, a lot of migrants want to be guest workers. They're dying to be guest workers, literally. So before you go and say that that's exploitation, remember, what they want matters too. And a lot of them will very happily take that deal. It's a tough question.
I don't know if this is in your area, but how many immigrants do we need to sustain our economy?
That's a great question. All I'll say is this. There are about 330 million people in the United States. If you triple our population, we would have about the population density of Germany. It's a very big country. There's lots of unused space in it. We could absorb a lot of migrants into this country without becoming a particularly densely populated country. So I don't know. It depends on what kind of migrants doing what kind of jobs, but there's a lot of space. Has anybody flown on a plane and just looked down? There's nothing but land.
What do you think about the quota system on deciding who can enter the U.S.? Example, there are a lot of people from Mexico, India, and the Philippines applying for residency.
Yeah.
Is there another just method you would recommend?
That's a great question. The history of national origins quotas in the U.S. immigration law context is not a pretty one. The ones that were initially devised in the 1920s were designed very explicitly with basis in a kind of theory of the hierarchies of different racial groups. There are still some remnants of that. I mean, they don't have the same kind of basis or justification, so they're not as objectionable. But I do think there's a really interesting question to ask. Should immigration law, should immigration policy prioritize or allow for greater entries from some parts of the world than others? And if so, what parts of the world is it possible, or what parts of the world is it acceptable for us to prioritize, right? So for instance, there are countries that have a closer kind of history to the US, right? Where migrant flows between the US and those countries are historically different for real reasons, right? And that might be the case with, say, Vietnam or Mexico, the Philippines. So the question is, should those countries be given more spots than countries with which we have less of a migrant receiving history? I think that's actually a good question for democracies to debate. I don't have a strong answer either way, but I think it's an interesting question.
In reference to the number 2 of using protection of culture as a reason for border control, then is not the overrunning or replacing of our U.S. culture with a single new culture that kills our mixed culture be a valid argument?
Yeah, so there was a book published on this a few years ago that was sort of about, there's a lot of talk in political theory about the treatment of cultural minorities, right? So people are very interested in this question of, well, what do you do if you have laws that seem to disparately or unfairly affect a cultural minority for one reason or another, right? So the classic example of this is in Canada, there were laws mandating the wearing of motorcycle helmets. You weren't allowed to operate a motorcycle unless you wore a helmet. Seems reasonable, unless you're Sikh. Sikh people wear a religiously based head covering that they're not allowed to cover. It's very, very serious in Sikh religion not to put anything over your head covering. And so Sikhs complained, in effect, this bans us from riding motorcycles. Because we can't comply with this law without deeply violating a religious belief that we have. And so the question is, where do you come down on that? Does everyone have to wear a motorcycle helmet because it's safe? Or is that actually a pretty biased law from the perspective of some people that, in effect, would prevent a religious group from doing something that they ought to be allowed to do if they have a motorcycle riding license, right? It's a tough question, and people have taken down different kind of arguments about, what do you do about issues like that? But a book was published a few years ago and said, we talk all the time about cultural minorities. What about cultural majorities? What kinds of claims do cultural majorities have to protect their way of life and the things that they want, right? And so let's imagine, it's tough. One of the reasons it's so tough is because the US is such a big country, right? And how many migrants would have to come into the US all at once, all possessed of the same culture, to really overrun a country of 330-some million people? It would take a lot. But I mean, you can imagine. One of the bases, and I don't know if this is a cultural or political distinction, but one of the bases that I can imagine as legitimate grounds for rejecting somebody from coming into your society is if they announced in advance their hostility toward following your laws. So if they said, I don't accept the legit. So let's imagine that there were a lot of committed monarchists out there, right? Let's say that 500 million monarchists get together and they say, they've been trying this representative democracy thing for too long. It's clearly not working. We're going to go in and we're going to replace this country with a monarchy. And there's more of them than us. And they all think the same way, and they might outnumber us if they came in. I think you would have a legitimate basis for saying, I'm sorry, no, we have some qualified right to protect the kind of life that we want to have, and if you absolutely refuse to sign on to that, you're not welcome. But if 500 million people showed up who were all of a religious minority that didn't belong in the United States, or wasn't well represented in the United States. So let's say you take some religious group in the US that represents, say, 1/2% of the population. And if you let in a certain number of migrants, they would then rise to, say, 50% of the population. I'm not sure of any rational basis for limiting that doesn't implicitly amount to saying, in order to be an American, you have to be from these religious groups and not those religious groups. And that, I think, is a road that a lot of Americans are very wary of traveling down. right?
Should immigrants follow the rules on the path to entering the country versus immigrants that illegally cross the territory?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how should law and policy distinguish between people who waited for a long time through legal means versus people who are here without authorization? And one thing to think about in trying to answer that question is all the different ways in which people sort of become unauthorized migrants, right? So there are a number of unauthorized migrants who did not cross the border illegally. They crossed the border legally, but then overstayed a visa, right? So they were allowed to be here for a certain period of time, their visa expired, they didn't go home. There are a number of unauthorized migrants who came because of circumstances that you might, in a kind of colloquial way, recognize as a refugee circumstance, but who for whatever reason can't get an asylum claim passed through a U.S. immigration court. And it's very, very hard. It's very hard to get a U.S. immigration court to accept an asylum claim. The standards for claiming asylum are quite high. And there are people who have fled political violence, domestic abuse, drug and gang warfare, who don't meet the legal requirements for asylum in the U.S., right? Now, do they have a morally compelling claim? Sure, but those judges don't judge morally compelling claims, they judge what the law says. And the law is very restrictive on this. A lot of undocumented migrants are people who were brought over as children, right? So they were taken across the border when they were 2 or 3 years old or even younger, grew up in the United States, and maybe didn't even know that they were undocumented until they were 18, and they went to go get a Social Security card and discovered, wait, I don't have one. I went to go get a job or go to college and said, what's your Social Security number? And they go, Mom, what's my Social Security number? And then they have to sit down and have a hard conversation. So there are lots of unauthorized migrants who come in different sorts of circumstances and ways. And how those claims ought to be judged against people who are just waiting in line is an urgent moral question. One of the reasons it's an urgent moral question is because unauthorized migrants are here now. They're already here. They're not hypothetically waiting to get in. And so, if you're trying to have a democratic society, one thing you have to ask yourself is, well, how are we going to treat the people who are present here, right? And so there's a proposal that you sometimes hear bandied about in discussions of immigration reform, where people will say, the deal that we ought to come to is, if you're an unauthorized migrant already present in the US, and let's say for the sake of argument, you haven't committed any serious crimes, you can stay, but you can never naturalize. You can never become a citizen. And sometimes this gets promoted as a compromise position where it respects on the one hand people's legitimate interest to want to stay in the country, but it also respects on the other hand the fact that they did break the law and maybe there ought to be some sort of punishment for that. But I think if you're committed to democratic principles, you have to be very skeptical of using the law to carve out a group of people who live among you but don't have political rights. So they have to live under the laws that you pass and they don't get a say. And then you can't say about those people, well, we're all citizens here and we're ruling over each other. Rather you say, some of us are citizens and some of us are subjects. And the subjects have to do what the citizens tell them to. And then I think you've gone a little ways away from having a democratic society and you're looking at something else. And that's a very serious concern.
That leads right into the next question. What percentage of natives now reject democracy?
What percentage of what?
What percentage of natives?
Natives.
I think that's what it says.
I'm gonna do the political theorist's punt on this and say, well, it depends on how you define democracy. I mean, do you think that democracy is, Walt Whitman in Democratic Vistas wrote, I ask you, a friend, did you think that democracy was for elections only? It minimally is at least that. Minimally, it's at least, we have to have elections to choose who's going to be in charge and what the laws are going to be. I hope most people are committed to that. I think elections are a better way of deciding that than the alternative. But I also think that democracy is more demanding than just elections. I think you can have elections and still live in a society that in important ways is not very democratic. And the more demanding your sort of understanding of democracy gets, the fewer adherents it's going to have, right? It's very easy for everyone to accept things that are minimal and easy. It's very easy for everyone to say, yeah, sure, elections, well, maybe not easy for everyone, but for many people. But if democracy requires more than that, then yeah, it might be a controversial ideal. I would toy with saying this out loud, and I don't know that I would necessarily adopt this as my own position, but you could argue that democracy has never been a terrifically popular idea, even in the United States, right? That its popularity is sort of bound up with its watered downness, so to speak, right? It's like everybody can agree to it because it demands almost nothing. You have an election every few years. That's it. Well, if that's all it is, that's very easy to sign on to. But even that is a fairly unpopular idea. I mean, if you go back here, my students are always shocked by this. When I teach the history of political thought, you have to go so far into history before you find any major political thinker who thinks that democracy is a good idea. None of them think it's a good idea. Plato thought it was a stupid idea. Hobbes thought it was a stupid idea. You have to go basically into the 18th century before you can find anybody with a kind word to say about it. And then you have to go into the 20th century before most of the world's governments become democracies. I mean, most of the world's governments are monarchies until 1945, right? By any standard definition, the US doesn't become a democracy until 1965, right? If you were to ask a political scientist what defines a democracy, they would say, well, at minimum, free and fair elections in which all citizens can vote. But if that's your metric, then the US doesn't become a democracy until the Voting Rights Act is passed. Which means that many people in this room lived through a period in time when the US was not a democracy by any reasonable definition. Just again, something to think about. I promised Maria that if I came, I would be interesting.
I don't know if I should commend you for the depth of thought, the things you forced us to think about, or for your ability to tap dance. But either way, I have truly enjoyed this. I'm going to leave you with one last question. This is a tough one. Are the midshipmen able to express their opinions without fear of retribution?
I think the retribution they fear is mostly from me. I had a student evaluation once that said, Professor Pippenger's always asking us for our opinions, but then when we offer them, he's always questioning our opinions. That's the idea. I think that the midshipmen, they're asked to do two things that are both important and that are hard to do at the same time. And one is they're asked to wear the uniform and be professionals, right? Which means the cause that they serve is protecting and defending the Constitution, right? The entity that they root for is the United States. They are also asked to be college students. They're also asked to be critical thinkers. They're asked to be people who are developing a worldview and a perspective on the world. And so part of what we have to do is try to get them to walk that delicate balance where they know when the time is to be officers or soon to be officers. They know when the time is to be in uniform. They also know when the time is to use their brains. And I teach in a field where what we do professionally is disagree with each other. That's what we do. And we draw on different conceptions of morality and justice to explain why we disagree with each other. And so I have to develop that among my midshipmen, but I also have to respect the fact it's not a normal college. It's a different kind of place. And that's a territory that we all have to be very respectful of. But they're smart. And they can think. They're usually a little too tired to think that well because they get pushed really hard. But we are working very, very hard to make sure that they become people that can wear the uniform and we can be proud of.
Nathan, thank you so much. This is really good.
So, first of all, I'd like to thank Ernie for getting us in contact with Nathan, and for Nathan to bring us from the world of everyday news to a little bit of academia, which we all need and we miss, for facing us with philosophical challenges, which many of us have not thought about. So it's been a great challenge. My little gray selves are working very hard tonight, trying to keep up with your theories. And I imagine my colleagues have the same, so I really thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my gosh. I want to give you
Thank you.
I want to give you two gifts. That is a pewter cup, which has our logo on it, and there's a nice pen with the same logo. Excellent. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. Okay, so on March 1st, invite you all back to get a glimpse of Moldova, a small landlocked democracy on the southwest border of Ukraine. You can imagine that these guys are taking a careful look about what's happening in Ukraine these days because they're next in line. They have a breakaway province of Transnistria, which already has about 1,200 Russian troops in it, right on their border. So stay tuned, and we'll see you back here next month. Thanks.